when an arrogant billionaire mocked a simple janitor saying, "If you can play that piano, I'll marry you." She had no idea she was about to experience the biggest shock of her life. What happened that night changed everything forever, and you won't believe the ending of this story. The night was perfect. The luxurious hotel gleamed with its golden lights, reflecting off the polished marble of the main lobby. It was another Thursday charity gala, the kind that the city's elite loved to attend. Men in tuxedos and women in expensive dresses circulated through the main hall, champagne glasses in hand, conversations in low tones about business and trivialities. Roberto Mendez pushed his cleaning cart through the corridors adjacent to the hall, trying to be as discreet as possible. At 30 years old, he knew well the routine of these events. 5 years working at that hotel had taught him that for the elite, employees like him were practically invisible. And he preferred it that way. Fewer problems, less confusion. The cart squeaked slightly as he headed toward the main hall. There were some abandoned glasses on side tables that needed to be collected before the main speech of the night. Roberto adjusted his navy blue uniform, checked that everything was in place, and entered the environment with careful steps. The hall was stunning. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting prisms of light over round tables covered with impeccable white tablecloths. White and gold flower arrangements decorated each table, and a small but elegant stage occupied the back of the environment. There, a black grand piano awaited the pianist who would perform later. Roberto began his work silently, collecting empty glasses and ashtrays. The guests chatted animatedly, oblivious to his presence. It was exactly how he liked it. Discreet, efficient, invisible. That's when she appeared. Valentina Montero entered the hall as if she owned the world, and in a way she did. At 30 years old, she had inherited an empire that included hotels, construction companies, and investments throughout the entire country. Her blood-red dress contrasted with her dark hair, pulled back in a perfect bun. Diamonds sparkled on her neck and wrists, each jewel worth more than an entire family's house. She was the main sponsor of that night's charity event. Her presence there wasn't out of kindness of heart, but social obligation. Appearances needed to be maintained, and donating a few thousand to charity was a small price to pay for good public image. Roberto continued his work, now more attentive to the movements around him. Valentina walked among the guests with a calculated smile, greeting important people, posing for photos. Her voice echoed through the hall every time she laughed, a loud and artificial sound that drew attention. "Darlings, what a wonderful night," she said to a group of businessmen. "I hope everyone contributes generously. After all, we need to help the less fortunate, don't we?" Roberto rolled his eyes internally. He knew this type of people well. They talked about charity while treating their own employees like trash. He continued collecting glasses, trying to finish his work in that area soon. That's when the inevitable happened. Roberto was bending down to pick up a glass that had rolled under a table when Valentina, gesticulating animatedly in a conversation, took a step back without looking. The impact was gentle, but enough to unbalance the champagne glass she was holding. The golden liquid flew toward her expensive dress, staining the red silk with drops that looked like golden tears. "What the hell?" Valentina screamed, her face contorting with rage. The entire hall turned to look. "You incompetent fool! Look what you've done!" Roberto stood up quickly, his heart racing. "I'm sorry, ma'am, it was an accident. I was just—" "An accident?" she interrupted, her voice rising an octave. "You destroyed my dress. Do you know how much this costs you, useless man?" The other guests began to approach, forming a circle around the two. Some were discreetly taking photos with their cell phones. Roberto felt his face burning with shame. "Ma'am, I can pay for the cleaning," he tried to explain, knowing he didn't have enough money for even one piece of her dress. Valentina laughed, but there was no humor in that sound. It was pure cruelty. "You pay with what money, my dear? With your janitor's salary?" The guests' laughter echoed through the hall. Roberto felt smaller and smaller, as if he were shrinking before all those judgmental looks. "Did you see this?" Valentina addressed the other guests, dramatizing her indignation. "This man is living proof that some people were born to be invisible, to clean other people's dirt, not to be among real people." "Please, ma'am," Roberto murmured, his voice almost disappearing. "Please what?" Valentina was clearly enjoying the situation. "You want me to pretend nothing happened? That people like you have the same value as people like us?" That's when her eyes gleamed with a malicious idea. She looked at the piano on the stage and then back at Roberto. a cruel smile forming on her lips. "You know what?" she said, raising her voice so everyone could hear clearly. "If you can play that piano better than a professional pianist, I'll marry you." The hall exploded in laughter. Valentina clapped her hands, delighted with her own joke. "Did you hear that, people? The janitor is going to give us a concert." Roberto looked at the piano, then at Valentina, then at all those mocking faces around him. Something inside him stirred, a mixture of anger, humiliation, and nostalgia. "But of course you won't be able to," Valentina continued, enjoying every second of the situation. "People like you only know how to clean. Music, art, culture, that's for people like us, for those who have education, refinement." The guests agreed with murmurs of approval. Some were already moving away, considering the show over. But Roberto kept looking at the piano. Valentina noticed he wasn't moving and became even more irritated. "What's wrong? Lost your tongue? Or did you finally understand your place in this world?" Roberto took a deep breath. For 5 years he had been the perfect employee, discreet, efficient, invisible. But at that moment something inside him was screaming to get out, something he had buried long ago. "I accept," he said. His voice was low but clear. The hall fell silent for an instant. Valentina blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly. "What did you say?" Roberto raised his head, meeting her eyes for the first time that night. "I said I accept. I'll play the piano." Valentina's laughter echoed through the hall like the sound of crystal breaking. "My God, he really believes he can. This is going to be even better than I thought." The silence that followed was deafening. Roberto could hear his own heart beating while hundreds of gazes fixed on him. Some guests had already pulled out their cell phones, ready to record what would be, in their opinion, an epic humiliation. Valentina couldn't stop laughing. "People, are you seeing this? He really thinks he can play piano." She turned to the friends accompanying her. "Mariana, are you recording? This is going to go viral on social media." Roberto swallowed hard. His hands were sweating and he discreetly wiped them on his uniform pants. How long had it been since he played a piano? 5 years? 6? It seemed like an eternity. Wait, Valentina said, raising her hand as if she'd had a brilliant idea. "How about we make this more interesting?" She opened her designer purse and pulled out a wallet stuffed with bills. 500 reais if you can play an entire song without making mistakes." The guests murmured among themselves, some smiling maliciously. Roberto knew this wasn't generosity. It was pure humiliation. Valentina was offering money as if he were a trained animal in a circus. 1,000, shouted someone from the crowd, a fat businessman with a cigar in his hand. 1,000 if he doesn't run away in the first 30 seconds. More laughter. Roberto felt blood rising to his face, but not from shame. It was anger, an anger he hadn't felt in years. "No," he said, his voice firmer now. "I don't want your money." Valentina arched an eyebrow. "Oh no? Then what do you want?" "I already said I'll marry you if you play better than a professional. Or do you prefer something more realistic?" "I just want you to keep your word," Roberto replied, surprising himself with his own courage. The hall exploded in laughter again. Valentina was practically doubling over with laughter. "My word? You really believe I would marry you?" "That's what you said," Roberto replied calmly in front of everyone. "My dear," Valentina said, wiping a tear from laughing so hard. "That was a joke. I would never marry someone like you. But let's have some fun. Play your 3 notes there. We'll take some photos for Instagram and then you can go back to your cleaning cart. How about that?" Roberto began walking toward the piano. Each step seemed heavy, as if he were walking through thick water. The guests opened space, creating a human corridor between him and the instrument. "Look at that. He's really going to try." Valentina was having tremendous fun. "Should someone warn the pianist we hired? He'll want to see this." Roberto stopped in front of the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway & Sons Model D. The keys gleamed under the chandelier light, each one perfectly aligned. He extended his hand and gently touched the lid, feeling the polished wood under his fingers. "What are you waiting for?" Valentina provoked. "Divine inspiration?" Roberto turned to look at her for the first time that night, his face completely serious. "What song would you like to hear?" The question caught Valentina by surprise. She expected him to simply try to play some simple little tune and embarrass himself. "What did you say?" "I asked what song you would like to hear," Roberto repeated, his voice strangely calm. Now Valentina exchanged glances with her friends. This wasn't going as she expected. The janitor should be trembling with fear, begging to get out of there. Instead, he seemed confident. "Anyone," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Play Happy Birthday, and that's good enough." More laughter from the audience, but Roberto didn't laugh. He just nodded and pulled out the piano bench. The leather was soft and well-maintained. He adjusted himself, set the height of the seat, and placed his hands over the keys. For a moment, the hall was silent. Even the laughter stopped. Everyone was waiting to see the humiliation spectacle that was about to come. Roberto closed his eyes. For an instant, he was no longer in that luxurious hotel, surrounded by cruel people. He was back to his 20s in a small conservatory with his teacher whispering in his ear, "Feel the music, Roberto. Don't think about the keys. Feel the music." His hands found the keys as if they had never been separated from them. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Valentina. "This is for you," he said, and began to play. The first notes filled the hall like a gentle wave. Roberto began with something simple, a melody everyone recognized immediately. But there was something different. Each note came out crystalline, perfect, loaded with an emotion no one expected. The hall fell into absolute silence. The laughter stopped. The murmurs ceased. Even the waiters circulating with trays stopped to listen. Valentina felt a chill in her stomach. This wasn't right. The janitor shouldn't be able to play like that. No one expected him to really know music. But Roberto didn't just know music. He was music. His hands danced over the keys with an elegance that brutally contrasted with his simple work uniform. Each movement was precise, controlled, but at the same time full of passion. The simple music he had begun started to transform. Roberto added complex harmonies, variations that showed deep knowledge of musical theory. What had begun as a known melody was becoming something unique, something his. Some guests exchanged worried glances. This wasn't what they expected. This wasn't fun at the expense of some poor soul. This was art. Valentina clenched her fists. How dare that man play like that? How dare he be good at it? People like him shouldn't have talent, shouldn't have dreams, shouldn't be anything beyond what she said they were. But Roberto continued playing, oblivious to the looks of surprise and discomfort around him. For him, at that moment, only the music existed, and the music was freeing him from 5 years of silence. Roberto finished the first song with a gentle cadence that echoed through the hall like a sigh. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It wasn't mocking expectation. It was genuine amazement. He didn't lift his eyes from the piano. Instead, without pause, he segued into a second piece. This time he chose something more complex, a sonata that required advanced technique and years of practice to be executed correctly. Roberto's fingers flew over the keys with a dexterity that hypnotized the audience. Each note came out perfect. Each musical phrase told a story. It wasn't just technical execution. It was high-level interpretation, the kind of performance one expected to find only in the world's best concert halls. Valentina felt as if the ground were opening beneath her feet. This couldn't be happening. The janitor, the man she had humiliated minutes before, was playing with a mastery she had only seen in concerts that cost thousands of reis to attend. "My God," whispered one of the guests, an older woman Roberto recognized as the wife of a famous businessman. "He plays like a virtuoso." The word virtuoso echoed among those present in low murmurs. Cell phones that had been raised to record a humiliation were now capturing something completely different. Some guests began to move closer to the piano, attracted by the music like a magnet. Roberto felt every fiber of his being coming back to life. It was as if he had been sleeping for years and finally awakened. His hands remembered every movement, every nuance he had learned in another life. The music flowed through him like a river that had been dammed and finally found its way to the sea. He modulated to a more dramatic key, increasing the intensity of the piece. The piano responded to every touch as if it were an extension of his own body. Roberto had forgotten what this feeling was like, the complete connection between musician and instrument, when technique becomes invisible and only pure artistic expression remains. Valentina tried to maintain composure, but felt her legs trembling. She looked around and saw she wasn't the only one disturbed. The guests were no longer laughing. They were listening, really listening. "Who is this man?" someone asked in a low voice. "How can a janitor play like this?" whispered another. Roberto finished the second piece with a series of powerful chords that reverberated through the hall like distant thunder. This time, when silence returned, it lasted only a few seconds before being broken by something unexpected. Applause. It started with one person, then two, then half the hall was clapping. These weren't polite applause from a social event. They were genuine, admiring applause, the kind of ovation given to real artists. Roberto finally lifted his eyes from the piano. His gaze met Valentina's, and she saw something there that made her step back. It was no longer the humiliated man from minutes before. It was someone who had found his true identity again. "Impressive," said an authoritative voice in the middle of the crowd. Roberto looked and saw a distinguished man approaching. He recognized the face. It was a famous music critic, someone whose reviews could make or destroy artistic careers. "I haven't heard an interpretation of this quality in years." Valentina felt panic beginning to set in. This was getting completely out of control. What should have been a cruel joke was transforming into, "What exactly? Where did you study?" asked the critic, addressing Roberto. Roberto hesitated for a moment. These were dangerous waters. Revealing too much about his past would mean explaining why he was working as a janitor when he clearly had talent for much more. "National Conservatory," he replied simply. A murmur of impression ran through the crowd. The National Conservatory was one of the country's most prestigious musical institutions. Only the most exceptional talents managed to be accepted there. "And what are you doing working here?" The question came from an elegant woman Roberto didn't recognize. He looked away. Life doesn't always go where we plan for it to go. The answer silenced curiosity momentarily, but Roberto could see minds working around him. People were beginning to understand that there was much more to his story than it appeared. Valentina recovered part of her composure. She couldn't allow the situation to continue spiraling out of her control. "Very well," she said, her voice a bit higher than normal. "You know how to play. Congratulations. Now you can go back to work." But Roberto didn't move from the piano bench. "I thought you wanted to hear more." "No, Valentina began, but was interrupted by a voice from the crowd. "We want to hear more," shouted someone. "Yes, play another," agreed another. Quickly, a chorus of voices formed, all asking Roberto to continue. Valentina looked around, horrified, seeing that she had completely lost control of the situation. Roberto smiled for the first time that night. It wasn't a smile of mockery or triumph. It was a smile of pure joy, the smile of someone who had rediscovered something he thought he had lost forever. "How about something more challenging?" he asked, looking directly at Valentina. She knew she should say no, should end this right there. But with so many people around, all waiting, she felt cornered. "Do whatever you want," she murmured. Roberto nodded and placed his hands on the keys again. This time, he chose one of the most technically complex pieces in the classical repertoire. It was a composition that few pianists in the world could execute perfectly. The first notes came out like raindrops, delicate and precise. Then, like a storm forming on the horizon, the music began to grow in intensity and complexity. Roberto attacked the most difficult passages with an ease that left even the music critic speechless. His hands moved over the keyboard as if they were dancing. Impossible leaps between octaves, scales that climbed and descended like sonic roller coasters, chords that demanded independent fingers working in different rhythms simultaneously. Everything executed with a perfection that bordered on the supernatural. Valentina felt as if she were witnessing her own humiliation in slow motion. Each note Roberto played was a slap to her arrogance. Each musical phrase was a reminder of how she had completely underestimated that man. The crowd was completely hypnotized. Some had tears in their eyes, others were recording with their cell phones, but not to mock, to capture something extraordinary they were witnessing. Roberto reached the climax of the piece, his hands flying over the keys in an explosion of sound and emotion that made the hall's chandelier vibrate slightly, and then, gradually, he brought the music back to calm, finishing with the same delicate raindrops he had begun with. The silence that followed lasted an eternity, and then the hall exploded, not in laughter this time, but in deafening applause. People rose from their chairs, clapping with an intensity Roberto hadn't seen in years. "Bravo!" shouted someone. "Extraordinary!" echoed another. Valentina looked around, seeing her social world turning upside down. The man she had called invisible was receiving a standing ovation from the same elite that minutes before had laughed at him, and worst of all, she had promised to marry him if he played better than a professional, and everyone had heard that promise. The applause still echoed through the hall when Roberto finally stood up from the piano bench. His legs were shaky, not from nervousness, but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. It had been so long since he last felt like this. Alive, complete, himself. Unbelievable, murmured the music critic, shaking his head in admiration. Simply unbelievable. How is it possible that a talent of this magnitude is... He stopped, realizing the delicacy of the situation. Valentina tried to regain composure, but her hands were visibly trembling. She grabbed a champagne glass from a passing tray and drank it in one gulp. She needed time to think, to find a way out of that impossible situation. "Excuse my curiosity," said an elegant lady approaching Roberto, "but I'm sure I've seen you somewhere. Your face is familiar." Roberto felt his blood freeze. This was exactly the situation he had been avoiding for 5 years. Being recognized, having to explain, reliving it all again. "I think you're mistaken, ma'am," he replied politely, starting to move away from the piano. But the woman didn't give up. No, I'm sure. You used to play in concerts, didn't you? A few years ago." Her eyes lit up with recognition. "My God, you're Roberto Mendez, the pianist." A deadly silence spread through the hall. Roberto closed his eyes for a moment, knowing there was no going back. His past had caught up with him. "Roberto Mendez," repeated another guest, an older man with golden glasses. "I remember. You were considered one of the greatest talents of the new generation. You played at the Municipal Theater when you were only 22 years old." "My God, it's true!" exclaimed another person. "I was there that night. It was extraordinary. But then you simply disappeared." Roberto could feel all eyes fixed on him. The same elite that minutes before had laughed at his condition now looked at him with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. How had a renowned pianist become a janitor? Valentina felt as if she were watching a horror movie. With each revelation, her situation got worse. It wasn't just a talented janitor. It was a recognized professional musician. Her marriage promise was becoming more real every second. "Why did you stop playing?" asked someone from the crowd. Roberto looked at the floor. Even after all these years, it still hurt to talk about it. "Some things in life are more important than dreams," he replied simply. But his answer only increased curiosity. People began to approach more, forming a circle around him. Roberto felt like a cornered animal. That's when a familiar voice cut through the air. "I remember the story." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Donna Marina, the hotel's oldest housekeeper. She had worked there for more than 20 years and knew all the secrets, all the stories. Roberto looked at her with pleading eyes, silently begging her not to tell everything. But Donna Marina had her own reasons for speaking. She had seen Roberto being humiliated minutes before and now saw an opportunity to give him the respect he deserved. "Roberto stopped playing 5 years ago," she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "Right after his parents died in that car accident." A murmur of compassion ran through the crowd. Roberto closed his eyes, feeling the familiar pain spreading through his chest. "He was an only child," Donna Marina continued, "and they had spent everything they had to pay for his music studies. When they died, Roberto discovered the family was full of debts. He sold everything he had, including his piano, to pay the creditors. People listened in religious silence. Even Valentina had stopped trying to find an escape and was paying attention to the story. But he could have continued playing, said someone. He could have gotten sponsorship, returned to the stages. Donna Marina shook her head. You don't understand. Roberto didn't stop just because of money. He stopped because music reminded him too much of his parents. Every note he played was a tear for them. Roberto felt tears burning his eyes. After 5 years of hearing that story told, it still hurt like the first day. He came to work here because he needed immediate employment, Donna Marina continued, and because he thought that away from the stages, away from pianos, he could forget. But music isn't something you forget. It lives in people's souls. Why didn't you ever tell us? Asked the music critic, genuinely moved. Roberto finally found his voice. Because I didn't want anyone's pity. I just wanted to work in peace and rebuild my life away from all this. But you wasted 5 years of talent, protested someone. I didn't waste it, Roberto replied, his voice gaining strength. I learned other things. I learned about humility, about dignity in work, about how to treat people. I learned that a person's value isn't in what they do, but in who they are. His words echoed through the hall like a silent reprimand. Many of the people present had never thought about this. For them, Employees like Roberto were really invisible. Valentina felt as if each word were a slap. She had called Roberto invisible. She had said he was born to clean other people's dirt, and now she discovered he was an artist who had sacrificed his dreams for his family. "But why are you playing now?" asked the same lady who had recognized him. Roberto looked directly at Valentina. "Because sometimes life forces us to remember who we really are." The hall was silent for long seconds. Everyone processed the story they had just heard. The humiliated janitor had transformed into a tragic and noble figure in everyone's eyes. "Well," said Valentina, trying to reassume control of the situation, her voice sounding forced. "It was a very touching story, but now I think you have a promise to fulfill," interrupted the music critic, his eyes shining with determination. Valentina paled. "What are you talking about?" "You said you would marry him if he played better than a professional," the man replied. "And from what we just witnessed, he doesn't just play better than a professional. He is a professional, one of the best I've ever seen." Murmurs of agreement echoed through the hall. Valentina looked around, seeing there were no allies anywhere. Everyone was on Roberto's side now. "But that was just a joke," she protested. "It didn't seem like a joke at the time," said a voice in the crowd. "You spoke very seriously and in front of everyone," added another person. Valentina felt the walls closing in around her. How had she gotten into this situation? How had a simple accident with a champagne glass turned into this nightmare? Roberto watched her in silence. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the panic setting in. Part of him felt a dark satisfaction, seeing her face the consequences of her cruelty. But another part, the part that had learned about compassion during these 5 years, felt something different. "Perhaps we should clarify the terms of this promise," he said calmly. Everyone turned to look at him, surprised. Valentina too, with a mixture of hope and distrust in her eyes. "After all," Roberto continued, "marriage is something too serious to be decided by a bet." Roberto's words brought momentary relief to Valentina's face. But this relief lasted only a few seconds. The crowd around didn't seem willing to let the matter die so easily. "No, no, no," protested the fat businessman who had made bets earlier. "A promise is a promise, especially when made by someone in your position, Valentina." "Exactly," agreed an elegant woman. "You can't simply back down now. That would be cowardice." Valentina looked around the hall, seeing that the situation was completely escaping her control. The same guests who minutes before had laughed with her were now pressuring her to fulfill a promise she never imagined she would need to honor. "People, please," she tried to argue, her voice rising an octave. "You can't be serious. I'm Valentina Montero. Do you really think I would marry a—" "A what?" Roberto asked calmly, interrupting her. "A janitor? Someone you consider inferior?" The silence that followed was embarrassing. Valentina realized she had fallen into a trap of her own words. "It's not that," she said quickly. "It's just that you consider us trash," Roberto completed. His voice was calm but loaded with wounded dignity. "People who were born to be invisible, as you said." The guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Many of them had employees at home. Maids, drivers, gardeners. Roberto's words made them question how they treated these people. That's when someone shouted from the back of the hall, "Someone filmed everything." Everyone turned to see a young man with a cell phone in his hand, a malicious smile on his face. "I posted it on TikTok about 5 minutes ago. It already has 1,000 views. Valentina felt blood drain from her face. "You did what?" "The guy's performance was incredible," the young man continued excitedly. "And your marriage promise, too. It's going to go viral for sure." Other guests began checking their own cell phones, and in seconds the hall was full of exclamations. "It's on Instagram, too." "Did someone share it on Facebook?" "My God, it's on Twitter with the hashtag Janitor Virtuoso." Valentina felt as if she were having a nightmare. Her humiliation was being broadcast to the entire world. In minutes, thousands of people would be watching the moment she promised to marry Roberto. 20,000 views, shouted someone. 50,000. 100,000. People, this is really going viral. Roberto watched everything with a mixture of fascination and concern. He hadn't expected the situation to take on this proportion. His intention had been simply to defend his dignity, not create a media circus. "Valentina," said one of her closest friends, approaching her with a worried expression, "you need to think carefully about this. Your reputation is at stake." "My reputation?" Valentina practically screamed. My reputation will be destroyed if I marry a janitor. Your reputation will be destroyed if you back down from your promise, corrected the friend. Imagine the headlines. Arrogant billionaire humiliates worker and doesn't keep her word. Do you want to be known as someone who doesn't honor her commitments? Roberto could see the internal war happening in Valentina's mind. She was cornered between her arrogance and the social consequences of her actions. 200,000 views, announced the young man with the cell phone. It's on television, shouted someone who had just received a call. The news channel picked up the video. Valentina felt her legs weaken. This couldn't be happening. In less than an hour, she had gone from respected hostess to the protagonist of a national scandal. Perhaps, said Roberto, his voice cutting through the chaos, we should have a private conversation. Everyone turned to look at him. Valentina, too, with an expression of desperation in her eyes. You would do that? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. I think we've caused enough spectacle for one night, Roberto replied diplomatically. Valentina nodded quickly. Anything was better than continuing to be the center of attention in that humiliating situation. Very well, said the music critic, clapping to get attention. How about we give these two some privacy to resolve this matter? But the crowd didn't seem willing to disperse. Everyone wanted to see how this story would end. 500,000 views, the young man with the cell phone was practically shouting with excitement. This is history being made, people. Roberto extended his hand to Valentina. Let's go. She looked at his hand for a long moment. 5 years ago, she would never have imagined touching a janitor's hand. Now that hand seemed like her only salvation. Hesitantly, she accepted Roberto's hand. The touch was electric, not romantic, but a mutual recognition that both were in an impossible situation. Is there somewhere we can talk? Roberto asked. Valentina nodded. The management office is on the second floor. They began walking toward the hall exit, but were followed by the curious crowd. Roberto turned to the guests. Please, he said, his voice carrying a natural authority that made everyone stop. Let us resolve this like civilized adults. There were some protests, but eventually people agreed to keep their distance. Roberto and Valentina walked in silence through the hotel corridors, each lost in their own thoughts. In the elevator, the silence was deafening. Valentina looked at her expensive shoes, unable to find words. Roberto watched the numbers climbing, thinking about how his life had completely changed in less than 2 hours. 1 million views, Valentina murmured, looking at her own cell phone. My God, 1 million people saw that. Roberto didn't respond. He knew that numbers were the least of their concerns at that moment. When they reached the management office, Valentina closed the door behind them and leaned against it, as if wanting to create a barrier between them and the world outside. So, she said, her voice trembling, what do we do now? Roberto sat in one of the armchairs in front of the desk. That depends on you. On me? Valentina laughed bitterly. You just destroyed my life, and now you say it depends on me? I didn't destroy anything, Roberto replied calmly. I just accepted a challenge you gave me. The consequences are the result of your own choices. Valentina moved away from the door and began pacing back and forth in the office. You don't understand. I have a position to maintain. Shareholders, investors, partners, they expect a certain type of behavior from me. What type of behavior? Roberto asked. Humiliating innocent people? No, she protested, but marrying someone from my social class, someone who understands my world. Roberto observed her for a moment. What if I told you I understand your world better than you imagine? Valentina stopped walking. What are you talking about? Before becoming a janitor, I circulated in these same environments, charity concerts, gala dinners, high society events. I know these people, Valentina, and I know exactly the type of pressure you're feeling now. She looked at him with a new expression, as if seeing him for the first time. Then you know I can't simply marry you, she said. It would be... What? Roberto stood up from the armchair. A scandal? A break from social protocol? The end of your credibility? She exploded. Yes. Roberto took a step toward her. Or it would be the beginning of something new, a chance to show you're more than just a spoiled heiress. Valentina stepped back, but Roberto continued approaching, his voice gaining intensity. You have a choice, Valentina. You can continue being the person who humiliates others to feel superior, or you can become someone who honors their words and treats people with dignity. She stared at him, her eyes shining with tears of anger and frustration. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking, Roberto replied. I'm asking you to be a better person. The silence in the management office was palpable. Valentina and Roberto stared at each other, each processing the words that had been said. Valentina was the first to break the silence. Do you really think you know my world? Roberto nodded. I know it better than I'd like to. And I know that behind all this wealth there's a lot of emptiness. Don't psychoanalyze me, she replied. But there was something in her voice that suggested he had touched a sensitive point. I'm not psychoanalyzing. I'm just saying I understand why you act the way you do. When you have everything, it's easy to forget the value of simple people. Valentina turned to the window. Do you think it's easy to carry the weight of an empire on your shoulders? Make decisions that affect thousands of employees? No, Roberto admitted. But that doesn't justify treating people as inferior. You treated me that way. He continued softly. You called me invisible, said I was born to clean other people's dirt. Valentina closed her eyes, feeling the weight of those words. I was angry. You had ruined my dress, and that made me less human. She turned to face him, and for the first time that night, Roberto saw something different in her eyes. It was no longer arrogance. It was regret. No, she admitted in a low voice. It didn't. Roberto approached her. Valentina, I don't want to force you into anything. I don't want you to marry me because of social pressure. Then what do you want? She asked, genuinely confused. I want you to understand that your words have weight, that all people, regardless of their profession, deserve to be treated with dignity. And if I apologize publicly, would that be enough for you to forget this marriage story? Roberto shook his head. It's not just about me, Valentina. It's about what kind of person you want to be. I don't know what kind of person I want to be, she exploded, her composure crumbling. I've spent my whole life being what others expected, the perfect heiress, the ruthless businesswoman. Tears began to flow down her face. Do you think it's easy being me? Waking up every day knowing that hundreds of people depend on my decisions? Roberto felt something stir in his chest. For the first time, he was seeing the real Valentina, a scared and overwhelmed woman. No, he said softly. It can't be easy. And now I have to deal with the fact that I sinned against someone innocent because I was having a bad day. Everyone deserves a second chance, Roberto said. I don't deserve it, she cried. I humiliated you in front of all those people. Roberto watched her, seeing the genuine pain in her eyes. And now you know how wrong that was. Knowing doesn't change what I did. No, but it can change what you do from now on. Valentina sat heavily in the chair. What do I do now, Roberto? Roberto approached her. That depends. Do you want to grow from this situation? What are you talking about? About using this as an opportunity, a chance to become the person you have the potential to be. And what person is that? Someone who uses their power to make a difference, who treats people with respect, who understands that true greatness comes from lifting others up, not humiliating them. Valentina was silent, processing his words. And what about the promise I made? Roberto smiled. How about we make a deal? What kind of deal? Marriage shouldn't be the result of a bet. How about you honor your promise differently? Help me return to music. Give me a chance to rebuild my career. Valentina looked at him, surprised. You would give up the marriage? Marriage was never the goal, Roberto explained. The goal was dignity, respect, a chance to start over. And in return? In return, you learn about humility, empathy. Consider it an intensive course in humanity. Valentina couldn't suppress a smile. Taught by my private tutor? Exactly. Valentina stood up and extended her hand. Professor Roberto, I accept your conditions. Roberto shook her hand, feeling that something had changed between them. Shall we go back and explain our decision? Let's go, she agreed. But first, let me fix this makeup. A student should present herself appropriately. For the first time in 5 years, Roberto felt hope. Hope of returning to music, of making a difference, of an impossible person being able to transform. Ready? He asked. Ready? She replied, and together they walked to face the world. When Roberto and Valentina went down to the hall, they found a surreal scene. The party had transformed. The guests were grouped in circles, all talking about what they had witnessed. 2.5 million views, shouted the young man who had posted the first video. You guys are famous. We would like to speak with you, Roberto said, his voice cutting through the conversations. The hall fell silent. Valentina and I would like to speak with you. Everyone approached. Cell phone cameras focused on them again. Valentina took a deep breath. First, I would like to apologize publicly and sincerely." A murmur of surprise ran through the crowd. "I treated Roberto unacceptably today," she continued. "I called him invisible. I insinuated he had no value, and that was terrible." Roberto watched her with silent approval. "I discovered that Roberto is an extraordinary artist who sacrificed his career to honor his parents. That demonstrates a character I would like to have." The guests exchanged surprised looks. This wasn't the Valentina they knew. "As for the promise I made," she continued, "Roberto and I reached an agreement." "What kind of agreement?" asked the music critic. Roberto stepped forward. "Valentina is going to help me resume my musical career. In return, I'm going to help her expand her perspective on the world. Roberto is going to teach me to see people differently," Valentina explained, "to treat them with the respect they deserve." "And you agree with this?" The question was directed at Roberto. "Completely. Forced marriage wouldn't benefit anyone, but an opportunity for mutual growth can change lives." Donna Marina approached with tears in her eyes. "Roberto, are you going back to playing?" Roberto looked at the piano. "I'm going back, Donna Marina, and this time I'm going to play not just for the elites but for everyone." "What do you mean?" asked Valentina. "Charity concerts, music accessible to all, using art to unite people." Valentina's eyes lit up. "I could sponsor that?" Slowly, Roberto laughed. "First, you need to learn to talk to employees without calling them invisible." Valentina blushed but also laughed. The music critic approached. "Roberto, I would like to write about your story." "As long as you include Valentina's transformation too," Roberto replied. "It's the story of two people who helped each other become better." 3 million views, the young man shouted. Valentina looked around, seeing the guests' faces. They were no longer mocking. They were interested, some moved. "There's something I would like to do," she said. Valentina turned to Donna Marina. "How many years have you worked here?" 23 years, ma'am. "And in all these years, have I ever greeted you by name? Asked about your family?" "Ma'am, The answer is no, isn't it?" "I treated you like furniture, Donna Marina," Valentina said, extending her hand. "Nice to meet you, really this time." Donna Marina shook her hand with tears in her eyes. "The pleasure is mine. Call me Valentina, and tell me about your family." Other employees approached, initially hesitant, then confident, seeing that Valentina was genuinely interested. "You know," said the fat businessman, "I also treat my employees badly. I never thought about it until I saw how horrible it was when it happened to you." "It's never too late to change," Roberto replied. "Could you teach me too?" Other voices joined in, asking to learn about treating people better. "How about a group? Weekly meetings to discuss more humane work environments?" "I can host," Valentina offered. "I have an auditorium. And I'll help with the music," Roberto added. "Music unites people." Valentina walked to the stage and picked up the microphone. "May I have your attention? Today I learned that true greatness doesn't come from how much money you have. It comes from how you treat people." Applause echoed through the hall. "Roberto taught me that we all have value. We all deserve respect. And I promise, I'll spend my life trying to be worthy of that lesson." She looked at Roberto. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." The hall exploded in applause. Roberto went up on stage and sat at the piano. "This last song is for all of us, for second chances and for the hope that we can always be better." He began to play an original melody inspired by the night's events. It was a song about redemption, about unlikely encounters, about how an accident can change lives. Valentina stood beside the piano, no longer as the arrogant billionaire, but as a woman who had discovered she had much to learn about being human. When the music ended, Roberto and Valentina knew they had found something rare, a second chance to be who they really could be. And the whole world was watching. And in the end, what touched people most wasn't the music. It was the reminder that we all have value, even when the world tries to silence us. If this story moved you, leave your like. It helps more people see the video. Comment below. Have you ever felt invisible at some point in your life? Your voice can inspire someone. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove dignity has no uniform. It has courage.